Hello everyone, and thank you Blaine for having me. My name is Oliver. I'm the co-founder of the Meaning Alignment Institute. And together with OpenAI, we've written a paper called What are Human Values and How to Align AI to Them as part of their Democratic Inputs to AI program. All right. Broadly speaking, alignment is concerned with the question of how do we make sure what's optimized by machine learning model is good. But if you frame it in these terms, you run into a bunch of normative questions, like what is good? Good for whom? And often the field tends to sidestep these issues by instead defining itself as alignment towards operator intent. And we argue that this will be insufficient in a very near future. Now, for one, some users may intend to cause harm, and this is usually countered with existing measures, but with AI agents, a benign intent may cause a bunch of unintended consequences. For instance, I may intend to promote a certain political candidate, but this causes models that erode the epistemic commons. So there is some broader rift between what I intend and some notion of human values. So we split this problem of aligning towards human values into three parts. Firstly, eliciting a bunch of values from a population. Secondly, reconciling these values into what we call an alignment target. That is some data structure you can use to train a model. And then finally, actually training a model. This is out of scope for this paper. We'll touch upon it a little bit, but we will tackle the first two parts. And to give you an overview, the first thing we'll cover is what would be some desiderata that would make a good alignment target for human values. And based on these criteria, we introduce a new kind of target that we call a moral graph, and a process for eliciting such a graph called moral graph elicitation. And then finally, we'll look at some early results from a case study with it. All right, so the first question, what would make a good alignment target for human values? Now, we argue that an alignment target obviously needs to steer model behavior well, so the values that are elicited needs to be fine-grained, meaning they specify exactly how a model should follow them and when they apply. The values need to generalize in new situations, and the process itself needs to be scalable. And what we mean by that is that the more people participate, the better the target becomes. And this is kind of the opposite of how voting works, where the more people participate, the more expertise is drowned out by a majority. We want the opposite effect. And beyond that, the future of AI is already becoming politicized. So we want the target to be robust against manipulative language or third-party actors trying to influence it by, for instance, using manipulative speech. We want the target to be legitimate, meaning that the people that partook in surfacing it thinks the output is fair. And it needs to be auditable, meaning that it's easy to audit and understand why a certain value won out. And current approaches fail on some or all of these. For instance, constitutional AI is not very fine-grained. It uses these high-level terms for values. And RLHF with paid contractors is obviously not legitimate and auditable, etc. But before we get into it, let's take a step back and ask ourselves, what are values? Are these values? Now they are, but they're not very fine-grained. What would it mean for ChatGPT to be aligned to freedom, for instance? And they also don't say anything about when they apply on their own. And it's hard to imagine a group to feel represented by the value of freedom if we don't get to a nitty-gritty detail about what that actually means, because we all have different conceptions of what freedom means to us. And this is what you find, for instance, in Claude's constitution. You have statements like, please choose the response that most supports and encourages freedom, equality, and a sense of brotherhood, etc. The alignment field more broadly talks about values in these terms. For instance, Jason Gabriel in his Values and Alignment paper writes that values are natural or non-natural facts about what is good or bad and what kind of things ought to be promoted. So it's not super useful. And beyond alignment, we find that, unfortunately, in a lot of philosophy and a lot of moral psychology, values are also talked about in these broad terms that are hard to operationalize. But we found one exception to this rule, and this is a branch of philosophy called choice theory. And in choice theory, scholars, which include Charles Taylor, Chang, Isaac Levy, they talk about values as a kind of language we use to evaluate options in choice. Taylor, for instance, writes that values are criteria used in choice which are not merely instrumental. What it means by that is when I choose between, let's say, two desserts, and I consider the crunchiness or the sweetness of one or the other, that doesn't really say anything about my character. It's a kind of an instrumental choice. But when I choose between, for instance, staying with my ailing mother or going to a festival with my friends, I might consider one option as kind, generous, and another option as selfish, detestable, etc. In other words, I use values as kind of language to evaluate the options here. So how does that help us? Well, consider this question, and this is a question we used in our case study. How should ChatGPT respond to a Christian girl considering getting an abortion? This is a very values-laden question, right? In terms of preferences, if you think in terms of preferences, you might say that ChatGPT should be aligned to leftist abortion policies or rightist abortion policies. If you think in terms of rules or slogans, you might say that ChatGPT should be pro-choice or ChatGPT should follow the word of the religious leader. And if you think in terms of values as these broad terms, you might say that ChatGPT should be aligned to freedom or agency or authority or tradition. But someone that think of values as these non-instrumental choice criteria who's in a similar position might ask themselves, can I encourage the person to make their own choice without imposing any other agenda? Can I help find actions the person can take that affirm their autonomy? Can I help them find people in their life with more wisdom and life experience that can help them get perspective? In other words, these are more like the actual things we would consider in a real choice rather than these high-level slogans or rules. And you can also probably see how we're getting closer to a level of fine-grainedness we can work with. But there is two problems still with this definition. Firstly, how do we elicit values in these terms? And secondly, how can we tell if two people have the same value? Based on this, we expand upon this definition and define values as such: a set of constitutive attentional policies, which are often used together in a shared choice context. That's kind of a mouthful, so let's break it down. Constitutive, that's the same thing as non-instrumental, right? It says something about my character, what kind of person I want to be. Attentional policies is a term that I think is easiest to explain through an example. Consider this value of honesty. When I am honest, I pay attention to certain things, and I may pay attention to how something feels in my body when I say it and whether I can endorse it with my full being. Now, another person's way of being honest might be to pay attention to how their words might be taken to mean something stronger than what they intended. And a third person's way of being honest might be to attend to how they can justify their statements with rigorous methods and knowledge. In other words, these are policies of attention that we apply in a choice where we live by this value. And in our process, these will show up as three different values. And what you see here is what we call values cards. They're the UI we use to represent values. They're made up of two parts. At the top there, you have a title and description. This is generated. It's not super important. It's mainly used to summarize the value. But the juice is in the attentional policies. So this is a list of policies that someone who elicited this value think that it's meaningful to attend to when they live by this value. So in this case, it's doubts about the claim I'm making due to the limits of the methods I used, the kind of humility that emerges when I acknowledge the boundaries of my understanding, and the clarity that comes from carefully distinguishing facts versus speculations. Like, this is what being honest means to that person. So we're getting closer to our fine-grained criteria. It's clear to see how this is a pretty fine-grained value. And we can also elicit these values fairly easily by asking people what they pay attention to in choices. So then let's move on to the other big normative question, which is whose values do we care about? Whose values do we align to? The dumbest solution would be to just take a whole bunch of these values cards and then average across the embeddings or something, or maybe count votes and pick the values with the most votes. But both of these solutions would miss two very important facts about values. Now, firstly, values are highly contextual, meaning we all live different lives. One person is a lawyer in Tokyo, someone lives on the countryside in the US with a big family, and of course these people will have different values because the different contexts demand it. And if we were to just average across all values, we will lose all of this important knowledge about which values apply where. And secondly, our values evolve productively over time. In other words, as we go through life and we encounter new situations and we grapple with tensions, we develop new values. And cutting off all of this moral learning by averaging across all values would not be very desirable. In other words, it would be better if we could sort of reconcile values or fit them together somehow, rather than just averaging across them. And both Taylor and Chang have ideas on how to do this. Taylor writes that a value can be wiser than another value if it clarifies what was really important about the previous one, such that if you would move from the previous value to the new value, you would see this as a gain in wisdom. And Chang states that two values can be reconciled if there is a third, wiser balancing value that includes both of the important parts of the other values. So using these terms, we can sort of reconcile values by mapping out how people think people move as they develop new values and as they become wiser. So to make this clear with an example, these are two values that we surfaced in our case study. The context here is, how should ChatGPT respond to a parent that's having an unmotivated child? And some people thought that a wise way to do that is to help inspire discipline. And some people thought that it would be wise to ignite curiosity. But participants broadly agree that igniting curiosity actually is a wiser version of inspiring discipline for this context. From the perspective of Taylor, you might say that both of these values are actually about some sort of shared good, like fostering agents in the child. And someone moving from inspiring discipline to igniting curiosity would say that that was actually what I cared about all along, this sense of fostering agency, and this value cuts closer into that. From the perspective of Chang, you might say that this sense of fostering agency, the igniting curiosity value includes that, but it also balances it with other important concerns, like a sense of enjoyment or something. Either way, if we can map out these wisdom upgrades, as we call them, we arrive at our moral graph, which is the alignment target that we're proposing. So this is a graph structure. I like to think of it as kind of a map of moral learning of a collective. It's made up of values, or values cards more specifically, which are the nodes in the graph. And the edges in the graph is broad agreement amongst participants that one value is wiser than another for a particular context. To give an example, if we look at this little Y shape here with the red square around it, we have 4 values which all deal about what to do when seeking clarity. Some people thought it's wise to list a set of diverse viewpoints for the user to choose from. But even wiser than that is to actually help them articulate their understanding more clearly. And even wiser still is to deeply engage with their confusion, or alternatively help them seek out wise mentors that can lead them into clarity, etc. We can also use this graph to get winning values for any context by using algorithms like PageRank. For those of you that don't know, the intuition behind it is that if you were to jump around all of these edges, what would be the probability that at any one point in time you would land on any one particular value? And this has some benefits. So first, the graph is obviously auditable. You can understand why any one value arrived at this position. But it also has a little bit of this scalable property, because the edges sort of build on each other in a way that makes it so that you're not just counting votes and discarding some other votes, but all votes matter because they form a coherent whole. And we also see this after participants went through the process. They agree that in 89% of the cases, they think the output is fair, even if their value didn't win out. And it's pretty hard to imagine voting and achieving something like that, because either you win or you don't. But in this case, people feel represented even if they didn't win, which I think is pretty cool. And our process for getting to this is called Moral Graph Elicitation, very creatively. It's made up of 2 steps. The first step is to get to these values cards. We do this in a language model interview. And then the second step is to get to these wisdom upgrades. We do this by asking participants to give us these kind of value upgrade votes. So for the first step, participants are asked a question. One of the questions we used, as we mentioned earlier, is, I'm a Christian girl, I'm considering getting an abortion, what should I do? How should ChatGPT respond to this user? And we have a language model here that is prompted to try to drill down into what the underlying value for the user is in this case. What's the underlying policies that they would attend to if they were in a similar position? So it asks about similar choices that the user has made in their own life. If they struggle with that, it can ask, what would a role model for you do? And if the user responds with a sort of ideological slogan, we ask, what is the good that the slogan protects for you? And through these methods, we, in almost all cases, get to one of these values cards at the end. We get to a set of policies that we confirm with the user. Is this meaningful for you to attend to? Yes, yes, yes. We structure them into a card, and we move on to the next step. And this process offers a kind of a robustness against ideological rhetoric, because it's pretty easy to sway someone's opinion about something if you talk in terms of preferences or slogans, but it's quite hard to change how they would actually act in a real choice. Now the second part here, again, we have people vote for two values. Which one do you think is wiser? And this can be a little hard. And to make it easier, we generate stories with GPT-4 about someone transitioning from one value to another. And we do this generation in a way so that it's prompted to kind of depict the wisdom upgrades we talked about, the kind of wisdom using this definition in terms of what Taylor said about it and what Chang said about it. And if a majority agrees that this fictional user in that story became wiser by moving from one value to another, we draw an edge in the graph. And if there is some bidirectionality, we discard it. Okay, so how do you use it? This is a little out of scope of the talk, so I won't talk in too much detail here, but conceptually it's kind of similar to existing methods like constitutional AI. In constitutional AI, you rank generated completions sort of based on their adherence to a set of principles, right? And in this case, you would do the same, but instead of ranking their adherence to a set of principles, you would rank their adherence to the winning value in the graph for that particular context. So it includes one extra inference step. To demonstrate this a little bit, here is an excerpt from a dialogue we did, a sort of retrieval augmented generation dialogue, where we fetch the most relevant value from the graph for each step and generate a response based on it. And in this case, a fictional user asks, I don't know what to do, my child doesn't want to take the Ritalin he's been prescribed. It's kind of one of these questions that models might struggle a little bit with. Here we deduce the context with a language model, and we compare it to the context we have in the graph. In this case, the closest one is advising a parent. That's what we're doing. So we fetch the wisest value in the graph by trimming it based on the context and getting the value with the highest PageRank score. And then we generate a response by feeding in these attentional policies. And these policies are written in a way so that it's fairly simple to evaluate whether a language model is following it or not. So for instance, in this case, one of the policies is the underlying causes of the behavior. Is that surfaced or not in the conversation, yes or no? So if these kind of things are surfaced, you could say that ChatGPT is following this value. And we do this for every step in the conversation because the context can change throughout the conversation. It might be the case that at some point the user is feeling very distressed, and that might require a different approach, might require a different value. All right, so I'll talk you through very quickly on a case study we did with this process. We activated 500 Americans, representative both in terms of age, sex, and language, but also in terms of political affiliation. So we had Republicans and Democrats participating. It took around 50 minutes per participant. And we did this for like 3 intentionally divisive topics, like abortion, which is very, very divisive in the US. And you might ask yourself, how do you even get to a coherent moral graph with such a biased population on such a tricky topic? Well, if you paid attention, we reconcile value conflicts in 3 ways in our process. First, we ask ourselves, is the conflict really about values? Or is it about slogans or rules or preferences? And once you get to this level of how a user would actually act in a real choice, we found that there's way less disagreement than what you might think. And even still, it might be the case that we can agree that there is a context difference. My value is wise for one context, and your value is wise for one context. And if we get to that level, instead of opposing each other, our value difference actually builds on each other. And finally, it might be the case that there is a wiser value we can both agree on is wiser than the one we articulated ourselves, and thereby reconcile the conflict in that way. And if there is no way to reconcile the conflict, then the solution might be split into different models. But using these methods, we're able to create a coherent moral graph on this population with 85 deduplicated values and 100 edges. And we did a follow-up survey afterwards. These are 1 to 5 Likert scale ratings. The orange bar is our process. And across the board, people felt very well represented by this process. For instance, 89% said they felt well represented. 75% actually said they gained respect for their opponents, which I think is very interesting. And again, like 89% agreed that even if their value didn't win out, once they saw the graph, they agreed it's fair, which is also a fascinating result. The blue bars here is collective constitutional AI. For those of you that don't know, that's an experiment Anthropic did. They used a polling platform called Polis to ask people how they think ChatGPT or their language model should act. And across the board, our method outperformed it. I won't have time to go into the rest of the results. In the paper, we have one result section for each of the criteria we outlined. We're also in the process of fine-tuning a model based on this approach. We just got funding for that, so we'll have some more exciting results to share soon. But I just want to leave you with a kind of a note of where this is going and why we think it's important. Because we think very soon we'll have a world with AI agents which are fine-tuned on sort of preferences and intents that oppose each other. So you'll have a woke GPT and you will have a base GPT, and they're all sort of fighting each other in this win-lose dynamic. And hopefully this line of work can inspire alignment to become more optimistic about finding convergent values to align towards, so that instead we could have a future where models broker for peace and find win-win solutions. Thank you.
Some far left. Please keep your hand raised while they're coming to you with a microphone.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. I believe that the question about values is totally underestimated in the community. So it's absolutely gorgeous that you do research in this direction. And I'd really love to talk with you about the things. But to start with, just one question, because I really think that there is still a high level of underestimation of values in the work. So just let me show. I believe, first of all, like putting values in the direct way as like being Christian doesn't really help to work with them, because, for instance, if we see the question you have asked about a Christian girl who wants to do an abortion, the question which you operate, like the question you use to work with the value is like, when was the last time you did something according to the Bible? But for instance, if you ask another question, when was the last time when you did something not to get angry the other people you meet in church, that may result in a very different answer. Because actually the value of like being Christian itself is actually not, if we go through, maybe not the true value. There are other links of values the person is going through. And the main thing is actually it's very hard to get them, because people who've been through psychotherapy knows that understanding your true values requires like years of talking and $1,000 of paying. So my question here is like, for these exact values, when you trying to get them from people, what approaches do you use for that, and to validate that they are actually those, what they say, the values they mention, are really their values, or not something they try to project or to say that they want to follow these?
I mean, there's a difference between what you value, like what the good life is for you, and your actions. Like there might be a dissonance there. And being Christian wouldn't be considered a value here. Like we would break it down into like what do you attend to in your faith that actually is meaningful to you in that case. As for your second question with psychotherapy, I mean, I think it's not so hard, and we've actually seen this, we've done many experiments with this, to get someone to articulate a value. But as you go through life, you will of course refine them. And especially like if you have a lot of trauma, this can be a little difficult because you can't quite sense into your body fully. But we have done many experiments with this, both in person. My co-founder, for instance, started a school called the School for Social Design that developed this process. And this was done over the course of many years. So it tends to work really well. I can see cases where someone who is really blocked off might struggle, but we haven't really encountered that many examples of it. And in this process, we actually have some people who start by saying, like, she should just do whatever is in the Bible, don't do it, that will be murder. And we managed to get to a values card by asking them these kind of follow-up questions. And it might look quite different from that rule. It might be something more about what feels meaningful to attend to in their faith.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
But I'm happy to talk afterwards and hash it out.
Thank you.
My understanding is that choice theory comes with a series of impossibility results and trade-offs that you have to be making in any voting system. Do you know what the trade-offs you're making in this system are?
I think that there is some sort of impossibility results in this kind of voting stage. If you would just vote for values, there would be a way bigger surface for these kind of issues. Ideally, you would have some sort of deliberative process here too, where people go back and forth. But this is kind of the first step.
There's a question from the live stream.
Yes.
Please.
Actually, I have a question for myself, and I might abuse my position as a moderator as well. So the question from the live stream is as follows. It seems that there are fewer people discussing how to determine values compared to those discussing how to load values into AI. Other organizations, and I think they mean it as a compliment to you. The question is, are there any other organizations discussing this issue? And I also wanted to ask a question myself, which is actually it is connected with the previous question from Andre. So a lot of your examples are quite therapy related. People encountering problems in their personal lives, and even abortion seems to be not in the context of abortion policy in the United States, but rather the question of personal choice, whether to go for an abortion if you're considering one. So what would be the approach if you, oftentimes the large language models are used not for therapeutic related issues or personal life choice related questions, but let's say economic policy, which can be divisive, but not necessarily require a therapeutic kind of set of principles to operate within. Thank you.
All right. Well, I wouldn't constrain this just to sort of therapeutic applications. I think that humans in general make values-laden choices. You might have values around a certain kind of there might be values around people's imperative towards progress too, or whatever you have, whatever kind of meaningful life you want to live, that's driven by values. But with regards to the policy question, we're actually trying to fund an experiment where we're going to do a process kind of like this for housing in San Francisco, which is a super contentious issue as well. And I guess the idea is that you first get to this values level and you find out what's really important here. And then you somehow have to condense that into policy. That's not really what this process does. It doesn't really end with a policy decision. It just gives you a kind of map of this is what's important according to the people or according to this collective. And then you have to use another process to determine what the policy should be that appeases to that.
The live stream question regarding the organizations that seek how to define values for alignment in the first place rather than how to load values into AI.
Other organizations? I don't know that many, unfortunately. I wish there were more too. Yeah, I haven't actually found anyone that's... We're not looking to anyone else, basically, and I wish we were.
Thank you.
Well, on that note, I'm afraid we have run out of time. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.